Welcome back to Enter Cheat Code, and today's topic is Native and Indigenous representation in games, where we will explore some of the most high-profile games that portray natives and examine whether it serves as a respectful, celebratory, and accurate portrayal, or one that propagates harmful stereotypes, fuels racism, and cultural appropriation. Natives are not a group of people that have been relegated to the history books. With that being said, any portrayal or representation in video games or media in general should be handled respectfully, accurately, and through consultation with the group being represented, rather than push false narratives, further fuel negative stereotypes, and inevitably contribute to racism and discrimination through their influence. So let's jump in and explore Native American and Indigenous representation in video games. I would also like to preface by saying, any example depicted as doing it well doesn't mean it's been done perfectly and without room for criticism. Our first example is Civilization VI, which introduces Cree leader Chief Poundmaker. The inclusion of this character was criticized by headmen of the Cree Nation, who said the game perpetuated the myth that First Nations had similar colonial values of conquering other peoples to access their land, and that is totally not in concert with our traditional ways and worldview. This representation works to fuel negative stereotypes and inaccuracies of the Cree people. According to Vice, the publisher of 2K Games, they did not seek the permission of the First Nations or consult the elders in regards to the use of their namesake as a character. To shift to a positive example of the game industry doing it right, which is the game titled Never Alone. It was developed by the first Indigenous-owned video game developer and publisher in US history, Upper One Games. It was developed in collaboration with the Inupiaq people. According to the game site, nearly 40 Alaska Native elders, storytellers, and community members contributed to the development of the game. Players will meet legendary characters from Inupiaq stories, all narrated by a master storyteller in the spoken Inupiaq language. Another failure of the game industry comes in the form of Mortal Kombat's Nightwolf, whose character guide describes him as using a menagerie of spirit animal power, which gives into the mystical native trope. This character has been criticized for being stereotypically savage. Despite this, the creative team has not taken any criticism from the native community in redesigning or retiring the character. This is a clear example of the game industry representing natives poorly and fueling false stereotypes of savagery. While I find it difficult to give Ubisoft any praise in this current moment due to their ongoing sexual misconduct scandal, which includes allegations of sexual harassment, misconduct, sexism, racism, and a toxic workplace environment, for the purposes of this discussion, we will recognize their efforts in accurately portraying the Mohawk people in Assassin's Creed 3. While describing the development process of the game, according to the Time article, the team said they realized they were running into too many stereotypes, faux pas, and factual errors, so they hired a Mohawk cultural consultant by the name of Thomas Deere. They were very receptive to Thomas Deere's feedback to accurately portray the Mohawk people, as depicted in the following quote from the article, which reads, "When the team asked about including ceremonial masks in the game, Deere warned them that any visual depiction of the sacred masks is considered offensive. He advised them on which types of clothing and jewelry to use and which types of spiritual music were off limits. Even Connor's name had to be cleared for use, as in Mohawk culture, each name had to be culturally unique, and Ubisoft's lawyers agreed not to trademark it." Next game, we have Infamous Second Son, which was developed by Sucker Punch. This example is not a blatantly offensive portrayal, but an example of a huge disservice and missed opportunity. The game takes place in Seattle, and the game's main protagonist, Delshin Rowe, lives on the Akamish Reservation and is a character defined primarily by his hatred of the game's tyrannical government and the care he has for those who live in his community. Rather than research the tribes native to Seattle and the surrounding area, Delson belongs to an invented one with no real history or culture to represent. Rather than portray a group in the area like the Duwamish or Suquamish people, this was an opportunity to portray a group of people that is grossly misrepresented and underrepresented in mainstream media. This portrayal continues a long and sad tradition of misrepresenting actual tribes and nations as some imagined homogeneous group of natives. Moving on to our next defender, Red Dead series. This game is an open sandbox adventure game set in the Wild West. This game does a disservice in several ways to native people. Many instances in which you must murder natives who are generally depicted as hostile. The game only has 3 native characters who are listed as non-hostile, and the character Charles Smith, who has a black father and a native mother, was not portrayed by an Afro-native and was instead portrayed by an actor of Japanese and Parsi descent, despite having famed native voice actors on staff. So ultimately, this representation furthers the myth that natives in the West were only ever hostile to settlers. One of Sony's most high-profile AAA games from developer Guerrilla Games, Horizon Zero Dawn, came under fire by members of the Native American community for appropriation and offensive portrayals and the use of offensive terms used to disparage indigenous people. The terms in question are tribal, primitive, braves, and savages. In an article written by Dia Lacina, she goes on to say that Horizon Zero Dawn has been described as taking place in a world where life has seemingly reverted to the tribal-like ways of the past. A phrase that erases how many indigenous people still associate as tribal communities and governments, and despite colonialist demands for assimilation, actively live their culture in much the way they always have. Appropriated and portraying these cultures, whether by name or representation, and describing them as primitive and savage, reinforces racist and colonialist ideas about indigenous people. So let's end on a positive note. Mulaka, which is a 3D platform based on the indigenous culture of the Tarahumara. You play as a shaman of the indigenous Tarahumara culture who draws upon the powers of demigods to fight creatures based on the region's mythology as you seek to fight back the corruption encroaching on the land. Developers work closely with the Tarahumara to ensure authenticity and would include music and language of the people, as well as their myths and legends. They went so far as to donate a portion of the profits to the preservation of the Tarahumara Sierra as well. The big takeaway here is that natives are a group of people with a rich culture that should be respected and portrayed in such a way. Underrepresentation is harmful, as is misrepresentations. The gaming industry needs to be more sensitive in their representation and not underestimate the influence in which they have. And on bigger picture note, we as a society need to do better in educating ourselves and also not relegate this rich culture and people to disgusting characterizations and sports team mascots, which are very harmful and seen as offensive to 4 out of 5 Native Americans. We need to stand up for a group of people that has been marginalized for far too long and has some alarming issues that must be addressed with urgency, such as the fact that Native American women across the country are being murdered and sexually assaulted on reservations and nearby towns at far higher rates than other American women, and murder rates of Native American women are up to 10 times higher than the national average for all races. These are just a few, but illustrate a dire urgency for us as a society to do better. Thank you for being with us at Enter Cheat Code. Please hit that subscribe button as well as the bell for notifications if you enjoyed this content. Please click on the description for important resources that pertain to this urgent matter. Always remember, with great power comes great responsibility. Until next time.